Welcome back to the TokenizeThis virtual conference by Security Token Market. Another great panel coming up right now. Listen, we're going to be talking about the rise of the Tokenized T-Bill, and we can extrapolate that to money markets and treasuries as a whole, treasury funds, individuals, what have you. And listen, we have an awesome panel here today. I'm Peter Gaffney, head of research at Security Token Advisors, and I'm joined by Michael Muir, head of digital assets technology at Franklin Templeton, Jerald David, JD, president of Arca, Philipp, Pieper, co-founder of Swarm Markets, and Sid Powell, CEO, co-founder of Maple Finance. Listen, guys, would love to just kick this off. You know, I know we all know kind of what the agenda is here. It's right in the title, and we all have some involvement in that. But wanted to kick it off with a round of formal intros, if you guys don't mind. And Michael, would love to start with you and work it around there.
Sure. I'm Mike Muir, and I'm responsible for our software development efforts as it relates to digital assets. Franklin decided to build an entire organization around this space and focus a whole bunch of people's entire attention to it. So we also build a lot of software to make all that happen.
Fantastic. Thank you. JD, you want to hop next?
Great. Thanks, Peter. Great to be with everyone today. My name is JD. I'm the president of Arca Labs. Arca Labs is the innovation arm, the division that's primarily focused on using blockchain technology to create digital assets that transform and work within the traditional financial system. We're the creator of the Arca US Treasury Fund, which is the first 40 Act fund that issues its shares as digital asset securities, which are called Arcoin. And I'm super excited to be with the group today and to share more about what we've been working on.
Awesome. Thanks, JD. And Philipp, what's going on with Swarm?
Thanks for having me. So we are a tokenization player actually out of Europe. We started off in the US and actually made our way over a couple of years ago. Today, we're a hybrid organization between being sort of a banking institution and at the same time sort of, preserving as much of DeFi and sort of, protocol layers as possible. But what we do with that is tokenize public stocks and bonds, as well as actually give this market infrastructure to different players for actually doing secondary markets and token markets. So tokenization, is completed with that kind of functionality.
Fantastic. Thanks, Philipp. And Sid, what's up with you and Maple Finance?
Thanks for having me. So Maple Finance is a debt capital market built on chain. We have, in the real world asset space, been doing pools that effectively lend against tokenized T-bills, and we've got about 40 mil in deposits there at the moment across Ethereum and Solana, and this has been an interesting product for DAOs, high net worths, and startups who have just done seed or Series A fundraisers to use. So very happy to be here.
Fantastic, great overview. Thanks, Sid. Listen, gentlemen, why don't we kick it off with kind of the obvious question that I guess we get from a lot of traditional financial folks. Why money markets? Why treasuries? Why are we starting there on chain? They're pretty liquid, pretty efficient as is. What's the whole story and what's the narrative that's being crafted around that?
Well, I imagine our story might be a little bit different to others. We began our journey quite a few years ago now, really just thinking about the practical uses of blockchains as it relates to our entire industry, particularly the many roles that Franklin Templeton plays as an asset manager in the financial services industry. So our choice of a money market fund to begin this journey of tokenizing a product and really bringing to life a new type of transfer agent was really just a prototypical choice. We thought that money funds enjoy a large amount of transactional activity. This is one of the sort of promises of these technologies, that transactional activity becomes more fluid, lower latency, cheaper. And so we thought, well, we might as well just start with that. As you probably know, everybody recalls, I'm sure, a few years ago, as my colleague Mike Reed mentioned on the previous panel, yields for treasuries and the like that are purchased by money funds was basically zero. So it wasn't really a commercial intention behind this. Over the course of time, we've had a rising rates environment, and so there is now some commercial opportunity around this. But overall, this is still our prototypical example, and really what we've built is technology and by way of a transfer agent that can be used as a target state solution for all manner of pooled investment vehicles in tokenized form.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we started creating the U.S. Treasury Fund, which we did, 5 years ago, similarly, there were, rates were not where they are right now, and we looked at treasuries as something that we could use as a proof of concept in working with the regulators and trying to, really create a new vehicle, a new pool vehicle for markets. And, when we think about how we approach things, our thought was, what is that we could present to the regulator that essentially, is easily digestible, is something that's, kind of quite understandable. And at the time had low volatility as well, and also backed by the full faith and credit of the US, government. So when we began, creating what we call a blockchain transferred fund, which essentially is the wrapper that surrounds the SEC registered product that we created, our thought was that it was easily digestible for many to understand U.S. Treasury. It made a lot of sense. Now, as rates are increasing, a lot of attention is being focused on treasuries, obviously, but more importantly for us, we think that there's a use case and utility for the tokens that are actually generated from these kind of funds, these different pooled investment vehicles.
Also to add, probably,
you got Philipp.
I guess that's Sidney's going to have probably a similar direction than I, maybe a little different from the previous, panelists here. So, on the tokenized stocks and bonds, our target audience is basically, crypto players in different shapes and forms, whether these are stable coins, trading organizations, but also the consumer that is in different environments, trading environments, that basically in this market actually is obviously very keen to get, yield bearing assets actually presented to them. And, not to have a systems break once they decide to actually move back into crypto assets or purchase something differently. So the market pull and market demand on that side was basically to say, offer the consumer, meet the consumer where they are, and actually offer them something that right now in this market environment is actually attractive. And actually, we're being approached by certain ETF providers to actually be that channel for them in that sense too, right? And so it's not just limited to T-bills, but obviously that's a pretty attractive consumer group that has started to learn pretty heavily what sort of trading is and how to manage their finances. So it's actually a pretty good consumer group to actually expose this to.
Yeah, I think T-bills were a natural choice because it's a simple product for everyone to understand. So you can then work out the technology and kind of leave the other things in place. So reduce the number of things that could go wrong just from an engineering and products perspective. And one of the interesting applications I see happening now is there's a lot of trading firms that have been having to use non-yield bearing collateral to collateralize their trades. And so I'm interested, and I think they're interested in getting things like tokenized T-bills accepted as eligible collateral, just so they can get better capital efficiency on the amounts that they're tying up when they're doing trading.
Yeah, totally. Philipp, by the way, congrats that you're Sid, I agree. And I think that's an interesting point, similar to JD's I'm about to ask more about. But Philipp, congrats talking. I mean, if the ETF players start getting involved in this a bit more, I think that's a huge domino to drop, and just like a very qualified one. That I think is great for the market as a whole. And
to my surprise, actually, the tonality is not, okay, let's create a tokenized ETF, but it's more, there's an option for the consumer to just digitize whatever they want to hold in terms of ETF. So it's just a hybrid, construct between these two worlds that now is becoming much more fluid between one and the other.
And even they saw the evolution from mutual funds to ETFs, obviously being in that business. And this is they're picking up that, okay, this is where things are going. So absolutely. And JD, you made an interesting point. I want to make sure I have it correct. Did you say maybe they're not able yet, but the goal is that, let's say, funds could actually distribute Arcoin or other on-chain treasuries to investors?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think about the way that we created our fund, right? The Arca US Treasury Fund has a portfolio of US Treasuries, and we're not a tokenized, treasury fund. We've got a mixed, portfolio that we manage actively, going out the curve. Our mandate as in our prospectus says that we could trade out, 8 years. We traditionally are now on the front of the curve, 6 months out, basically. But essentially what we've created here with this token is something that we believe is both an investment vehicle, but also can be used as a utility function. The investment vehicle component of it really is the evolution of the ETF, right? You've got mutual fund, ETF, and now we've created what we're calling the blockchain transferred fund. The blockchain transferred fund is essentially that portfolio of treasuries that issues shares. Those shares themselves can be held in a, MetaMask wallet, if you wish. You can receive, 4.5% plus yield, whatever we're yielding right now. Or you can actually take that and, to Sid's point, you could take that and you can actually use that for collateral. You can use that for treasury management. Our thinking on that and the exploration that we've been engaging in is with larger scale financial institutions and trying to understand how it is that they could take those security movements that they have internally and replicate them with a digital asset. And in our case, it's a digital asset security, and there's no ambiguity there because our fund is registered with the SEC, and we registered that in July the 6th of 2000. So we've had some experience in working with the SEC for the past 5 years and trying to do so. So I guess to your point, Peter, the answer is yes. This can be transferred peer-to-peer on the Ethereum blockchain, to satisfy, any sort of a payment or collateral movement, or it can be used as a investment vehicle for someone who's looking simply to, maximize their yield on their capital.
Awesome. Sid, would you say a lot of your, let's say, Maple's users, are they kind of sitting tight in on-chain treasuries or money markets? Are they actively rotating in and out? Is it more like, that's just where they're kind of parking their capital till they see opportunities that are jumping at them? Curious if there's any.
Good question. Yeah, it's a good question. Funny enough, it's actually a mix. So it's probably 50-50. So I would say where it's let's say like a startup, they might have just raised 5 mil in like a seed or seed or Series A, and they just want somewhere to park it. So they're relatively inactive, and they might spread their exposure across a few different providers. Where we see more active allocations, it's is like high net worths or yield funds. So they will sit in it while they're waiting for a better opportunity to pick up. So we recently did like an over collateralized loan, and what we found was some people put their money into the cash management pool for like a week or 2 weeks while they waited for that one to become available. And so that's I guess more of a sophisticated investor and user type of behavior, whereas the different job to be done for your average startup is just keeping their money somewhere for a longer term. So we try and cater to both needs.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, I'm sure you're seeing some interesting stuff, even like on the active side. Like it'd be very cool to see, and we don't have to go in now, but it'd be cool event like in the future to see kind of what the activity really looks like and how firms are making use and kind of molding their strategies just around. I mean, with the risk rate so high, and like seeing how that is affecting the rest of the, let's say, just loans on Maple and similar platforms. Like very curious how that's going to play out over the next couple of years in retrospect. But always good to ask about.
No, I agree. And I think interestingly, like another use case would be seeing these types of products, everyone included on the call, those assets being supported at custodians as well, because that's when you start to unlock like those second layer of use cases where maybe their clients can kind of park them there as collateral for borrowing or as collateral for like mirrored exchange trading, that type of thing. Like I think that's kind of where the puck is going.
Yeah, interesting.
But I would add to that also just, starting off with, DeFi platforms that then can take the nucleus of actually T-bills and actually build derivative products out of it, right? So it's not just limited to custodians on the institutional side, but actually there's going to be a lot of creativity that where these, elements are now going to be put into a different context. And I think we're going to be very surprised to see what actually comes out of that kind of world, because actually the proper tokenization of T-bills is a fairly recent development in that solidity, right? So we obviously have to go down to the nuts and bolts to make sure that it's actually insolvency protected, and then as people can rely on really that asset being there the way that it's described. And now with this being there, I think there's going to be a lot of like different derivatives that are going to start to be created.
Yeah, Philipp, and I think to that point, I think that's one of the reasons why we thought that the regulated path made the most sense, right? Because when you're dealing with the 40 Act fund, when you're dealing with kind of a fund administrator, you're dealing with transfer agent, you're dealing with fund accounting and a distributor, you're dealing with all the elements that are out there that are verifying real time that the assets you actually are stating that you have are being held in a custodian and they're being held where they are, and there's full transparency through the publishing of like a daily NAV, for example. And we think that's one of the things that's super important why we opted to go down the path of an SEC registered product.
I could just add to something that JD mentioned earlier as well. In terms of this idea of new features, new capabilities, there's sort of this concept brewing here where there's new life being breathed into a rather old pooled investment vehicle construct called the 40 Act fund, at least in the case in the US. And these features, some of them are completely new that really haven't been seen before, and some of them are really just much, much faster and more granular versions of the same thing that's happened in the past. Like take transferability, for example. To authorized holders of a 40 Act fund can transfer shares between each other, but the process to do so in the traditional environment is quite cumbersome and very time consuming. So now we have the same capability, but it's far faster with lower latency and ostensibly less cost. That seems so tempting to think that we can just simply turn that on. And technologically, I think it's true. You can simply turn that on. But the regulatory environment is the real sticking point here, because the type of considerations that they make and the type of threats that they consider and the risks that they consider are quite different when you take the same functionality and make it a lot faster and a lot quicker and a lot easier. That's really going to be the uphill battle over the next year to 3 year time frame.
Interesting. I mean, kind of on that note, on utility and on different jurisdictions, I guess, what are your guys' thoughts on all the stuff we're seeing from the banks on the repo side, on just collateral mobility as a whole? Do you see that kind of, staying with a certain jurisdiction? Are you seeing that? Is that going to globalize? Is that going to offer a chance for all of your products to kind of have a say or kind of fit into a mold? Curious what that would look like.
Well, I think you will see over time, it's not as if this is a new thing, a sort of FOMO in the regulatory community, where some jurisdictions and their regulators will be more willing to allow experimentation to take place or simply allow for products to go live broadly across their economies and their citizenry, and enable greater capability for the investor at the end of the day. And you will see other regulators who have been a little bit more circumspect about allowing those things want to catch up. There will be political pressure applied to regulators that lag in this affair. And it's, I think, certainly the case right now that there's a huge disparity amongst regulators globally in terms of not just their willingness to enable these capabilities and this new substrate of financial services, but also their learning curve and their understanding about how these things actually function mechanically. So we're still, in my opinion, at the midpoint of that journey. We're nowhere near the end state where you have common understanding amongst global regulators about how these things actually will function, let alone a common willingness to allow them to function.
Yeah, I'll mention on top, basically, we're regulated in Europe under BaFin in Germany, right? So, and we specifically went to Germany because of, we believe, some of the hindrances in this space that actually we were seeing in the United States unfold. So we are happy that there's a homogeneous European market that has stepped forward and actually brought out a framework about this. But still, even with the UK and the FCA, there's basically still some dissonance, and it will find its way. And I believe over time, like Mike was mentioning, actually sort of will be a good test bed for a lot of things that then, the legislators in America will actually then be able to incorporate. And I think that they're looking very excited and, curious actually how things might play out in Europe as a result of what's happening right now. Right. But, it's really, it's not unclear actually when this is going to happen in terms of homogeneous legislation or regulation, and how far you can actually go in actually bringing out something that normally is a globalized industry, but now in these dimensions, we have to think a little more regionally just because the constraints are there.
I think the capital mobility is interesting because effectively what you're doing when you tokenize this stuff is you're locking it down in the off-chain side of things. So it sits with the custodian, and then you're providing mobility to the tokenized version of the asset. So you have the T-bill, let's say that's the underlying core asset, and then you have the derivative of the T-bill, which is the tokenized version, and that can theoretically move much more freely around the globe, just subject to kind of legal restrictions on transfers and secondary sales. But I think over time, you would hope that the natural, arrow of development is towards more freedom on the secondary side of things, so that people, effectively, if you think of money in the financial system as a network, like what you want is lower latency and less capital locked up in pockets where it's not really doing anything. Like money is ultimately a commodity, and so it should be able to kind of move freely around the globe. And go to kind of where the best commercial opportunities are available. So I hope to see a lot more kind of cross-border repo transactions now that you have these tokenized low risk or lower risk instruments.
Yeah, I mean, and to build on that, I mean, our vision is that anytime that you see a securities movement in any sort of financial institution, our vision is that that's going to be, tokenized at some point, and you'll be using a tokenized version, whether it's our coin, whether it's, other instruments that are out there right now, in order to increase the efficiency, to lower risk, and to, effectively ensure that transferability and time are maximized in both ways. And if you think about the way that the financial system works, we talked about this on the prep call, kind of there's cash and then there's securities movements. And, the securities movements really, are something that's very, very ripe for tokenization and for the ability for folks to really mitigate risk by increasing transparency, transferability, and time as well.
Interesting.
And maybe to add maybe the consumer here, right? So, I mean, so far the crypto space has been obviously sort of, driven by believers in cryptocurrencies, and that's great, and it has led to this great marketplace. But we're already seeing the early innings of actually trade finance coming in, and basically sort of using that automation and the sort of the digitization abilities to actually just do a much faster settlement when it comes to sort of goods and products movement, et cetera. And I think that is going to be a huge drive. Like it just surpasses in orders of magnitude actually just the cryptocurrency market if you actually capture a couple of percentage points of that market. And I think we're going to see like tokenization being driven by that more than just tokenizing a piece of real estate. It's going to be really efficiency gains of actually dealing on a global scale with trade finance rather than actually sort of thinking about replacing a financial market ecosystem.
Yeah. I like that you mentioned the trade finance option, Philipp. I think the repos seemed, maybe they still are, to be the low-hanging fruit or the Trojan horse. Trade finance and letters of credit. I know like Sidney was doing a fair amount of work with that, and I've rolled it out more formally. Next up is probably like securities lending and anything in that nature. And then beyond there, I don't know, things in the alternative space. I think it's TBD, but it's all moving in that same direction. What I think is really, a big question in this industry, and maybe this is a little removed from even this topic, but how do these on-chain products really get distribution? I just held the fireside with Mike's colleague, Mike Reed at Franklin Templeton. And we had, Benji Investments on the retail side, Benji Institutional, or maybe not Benji, but the institutional interface. I'm very curious how you guys are finding, is it organic users or banks or asset managers looking to diversify? Is it on-chain companies, DAOs, just firms with their treasuries looking to work with on-chain products like this? Or is it really like more formalized on the banking side, on the traditional side?
Well, our experience so far has been that there is interest from, we'll call them native actors, crypto native actors, whether they're individuals or whether they're businesses that are really hinging their businesses on these technologies. That's where the natural interest is, in the idea of, I'm going to use these technologies to drive my business, and I'm going to traffic in cryptocurrencies. Well, I'm going to manage my treasuries with something that's on chain as well, that I can use all the same tools and have all the same benefits that I enjoy with a cryptocurrency. Now, having said all that, we're at a sort of a version 1 of the big picture of distribution capabilities. We are currently permitted with 40 Act fund to distribute directly through our broker dealer to clients. We're not yet permitted to distribute through third parties. And a third party distribution model is the norm for certainly our business and the general industry of gold investment vehicles and public vehicles at that. So that's going to be a pretty major unlock when the regulatory community as well as the distribution community realizes the efficiency gains that can come from stripping out intermediaries that no longer need to reconcile the movement of shares from an issuing transfer agent to a distributing broker dealer or a network of broker dealers. That goes away with these technologies. When there's a broad realization of that and the kind of improvement in just quality and accuracy, not to mention the stripping out of an unnecessary intermediary, along with a regulatory embracing of that style of distribution, I think you're going to see a sort of a step function in the distribution of these things, particularly in the United States.
Interesting. And Mike, is that, I don't know if you could say, but is that third party, is that pending kind of something on your end, or is that on the regulation side? Is it just other brokers that are not necessarily comfortable or confident dealing with the technology yet?
There's not enough regulatory clarity in the United States on what licensing exactly is needed for third-party distribution of tokenized securities. So as it stands, there is only one entity on the planet that's been granted such a license, the special purpose broker-dealer license to do so. However, that's not a live platform. So there is a regulatory journey to go through there, and I think that's achievable. I think that it can be demonstrated quite simply that this is a more reliable environment, a safer environment with better information security qualities than single databases held by a variety of different companies that have to be reconciled together with each other and then come into sync with each other periodically. This idea of a shared data state on public blockchains is simply a better solution to that kind of data synchronicity between different entities. That's the sort of, call it compliance/regulatory gate to go through. And then there is the need for parties to come to bear as third-party distributors, broker-dealers. There are businesses that we all know that handle cryptocurrencies and exchange and offer cryptocurrencies as broker-dealer type entities that can do this, but they need to know from our regulatory friends exactly what type of licensing and registration processes they need to go through.
So Peter, for all the reasons that, Michael's mentioning before, we opted to set up our fund as a closed-end interval fund. And some of the benefits of our fund, which are very different than, kind of the product that, that Michael has, is the fact that our tokens are allowed not only for subscription and redemptions, which happens through the fund, but we also are allowed to peer-to-peer trade these on the Ethereum blockchain. So anybody who themselves is, whitelisted on, for our fund through our transfer agent has the ability to be in receipt of these actual tokens, digital asset securities, and they can move freely from, Philipp's, wallet to Sidney's wallet, from my wallet to yours. And that, kind of for us is a really, really, really big thing because it allows for us to, kind of mitigate that entire concept of distribution, right? We've got a fund distributor we're required to. We've got some distribution agreements in place that the fund distributor authorizes, but our tokens can be transferred freely from anybody who's whitelisted, which really, is a super, super cool feature. And one of the things that, we had thought about, early on. The final leg of the stool for us is going to be to be able to trade our tokens on an ATS. So then you'll have three different pools of distribution. You'll be able to really, or liquidity, I should say. One's through an ATS. The second is peer-to-peer transferred on the Ethereum blockchain. And the third is to redeem those through the actual fund itself.
Okay, interesting. And Mike, you mentioned, let's say going through third parties. JD, you're mentioning the ATS listing and all this. I don't know if you guys were able to see the liquidity panel yesterday, but even OTC Markets Group was talking about their inter-dealer quotation system and basically routing orders to a bunch of different broker dealers and how now they support digital asset securities as of May. I always thought that for the last few months, thought that was a pretty big deal. And that's something that, kind of flew under the radar for a lot of people in just the general capital markets. Do you think that would be as big a deal as, maybe it sounds on paper? I mean, if that could be a central distribution point that is now going out to all these different brokers, I guess it may come back to the same regulatory comment, Mike, but, curious if that's something that we should all keep an eye on.
There's no doubt in my mind that the capability brought forward by a public blockchain where you have this common data set, basically, that all actors observe the same state of information at the same time. It's just a materially better data distribution mechanic than everybody running their own databases and trying to synchronize those things together periodically. That's at the real root of these capabilities. So everything you just said, Peter, is certainly possible technologically. The rub right now, and why I think we're in the middle of this whole journey, is because when you have the authentic system of record on chain, and you're not putting that somewhere else so that you're actually presenting something new to a regulator, they are being very circumspect about the features that have been enabled for that. I don't think there's any obstacle to these things being enabled over time, but they're certainly looking to take a baby step approach to enabling these things step by step so that they can fully understand the systemic risks and fully understand the actual ramifications of these products before they become a very significant part of the global economy.
And to that point, I think, it took us 3 years in intense conversations with regulators to get to that state. And we're thankful for that clarity that Mike was actually referring to, that we in Europe now know how to distribute, and we can actually deal at this point with third parties, and we can start the ignition of these businesses, which is a huge deal, right? Because in the end, it's about bringing these things into the real life of people, and connecting them with the way that they can normally spend with a credit card, possibly, right? And it's not like this distant system that is away from everything else, but we need to actually get the clarity to put it into the daily lives of investors and users and anything in between, right? And the other piece I think to mention is that we as an industry, obviously, because we hadn't been there yet, we have not been able to yet work on the simplicity that actually is then required to actually make everyone feel as if it's just another investment platform. And it's not something where you need to know what a wallet is. We just recently had, crypto custodian licenses really clarified also in Europe. So, that allows us now to actually sort of build, technology and user experiences that basically look as if you're signing up to a Web2 portal. But underneath, obviously, there's a very, very different guts of the system that then carries all the benefits and brings them forth into that experience.
We talk about this a lot, in fact, and I really like the point that you're making there. It's almost like there's a new type of interface going on here. When you think about Web3, we've got our user interfaces, right? In our case, we've got a retail-oriented user interface. It's a mobile app, and an institutional-oriented interface. It's a web app. And then we have programming interfaces, as you might classically think of them. There's really a new type of programming interface inherent in this, which is this idea of signing transactions and submitting them to blockchains to interact with smart contracts. And so that can be done in a more decentralized manner than a traditional programming interface through a centralized web server. And I like to think of that as a new type of interface for these things to come about. So we can have kind of our cake and eat it. We can have an interface that hides the technology from an end user, a retail end user that really doesn't care that there's a blockchain involved. And you can go all the way to the other end of the spectrum where you're dealing with a programmer who wants to deeply integrate some kind of trading system to a financial product, or orchestrate some kind of programmable functionality, recomposability of these instruments that are being represented in token form, and everything in between. I think that is really the big picture of what we're all trying to achieve.
Definitely. Is there any key? I mean, this could be an endless question. Any key infrastructure components that are missing or that just have to be upgraded, or do we really have like a minimum viable digital system, in our hands today?
My view is on and off ramps and number of stable coins. Like, just the quantum of stable coins is too small. Probably needs to be like 10x higher. And then we just need ubiquitous on and off ramps. So I think particularly like the main way today is you have to on ramp into USDC through Coinbase Prime, send it to a wallet, and then you can purchase these or access them through smart contracts. But I think we need more different gateways to do that, and we have a very narrow kind of a narrow funnel at the moment.
Yeah, Peter, I think that there's generally speaking a lack of standards, across both geographic locales, industries, and the way that folks are approaching things. I feel like there's a whole slew of different, banks that are looking at, the way that they want to deal with, tokenized treasuries in a very, very different way. I think that there are standards that need to be adhered to. I think there are standards that need to be implemented. And I think that, kind of if folks were able to be a little bit more cooperative and stop working in isolation a little more, I think that we'd start seeing some greater steps forward right now. And I'm not pointing fingers at, institutions specifically. I think it's because of a lot of different regulations that they need to step through. Things like, the conversation regarding the private blockchain and the public blockchain, and, what folks can actually deploy on as well. I think are, some of the things that are creating the friction that exists within the marketplace. But common standards throughout the industries, I think, would allow for a lot more progress made and a lot more faster.
I'd just like to echo what Sidney said earlier. I think it is something we certainly face as a challenge right now, and that is what we call the cash leg. For a subscription or a redemption is incredibly slow and painful. It relies upon the existing banking system. Now, there's efforts underway, as you all know, to speed up that banking system, but it's nowhere near close to the kind of latency and speed of transfer that's going to be necessary to keep up with the capability of these tokenized products in the future. And I think it's just a pain that we're going to have to deal with until there's a critical mass of activities taking place natively on blockchains, and you don't have to go back and forth through a banking system so much. The other thing I'd really highlight here, and it's more specific to pooled investment vehicles, is fund administration and market availability or market hours. If you sort of think about the lowest common denominator of these instruments that have been purchased in a pooled investment vehicle, those instruments are only available certain times of the day, certain days of the week, usually excluding holidays, depending on the marketplace. And so a pooled investment vehicle can't come in and out of any instrument that it buys and sells outside of those windows. Those things have to be modernized as well before we get to this kind of, target state solution for the entire financial services industry where everything is 24/7 by 365 and happens more or less in real time.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. And I think, that's probably why banks are looking at even, tokenizing deposits. If they're going to look at their own internal digital systems, like you need some mechanism. I think people are starting to think that, myself included, money markets or treasuries could just help rotate out of stables in the meantime. But I also see value adds for each of them, just simplicity wise and whatever. But listen, guys, this has been amazing so far. I know, we're coming up on, I think we have like 5-6 minutes left. There's a question and I got a couple. So actually let's kick it off there. Question for Philipp. You mentioned you specifically picked Germany. Why not Switzerland with its pro-crypto regulation? And do you plan to expand to Switzerland?
Oh, so we're big fans of what Switzerland has had historically and how innovative Switzerland has been. But in fact, actually, I'm in Liechtenstein because actually the mother company is in Liechtenstein. So we started coming from the United States in Liechtenstein because it was much more advanced as a small jurisdiction to actually have a much more comprehensive view. The reality, though, is that with MiCA coming in, that Switzerland is going to be an island within the regulatory environment around it. And you cannot just passport a regulatory situation in and out of Europe at that point in time. So a lot of players that traditionally were outside of Europe will have to actually build a local regulatory presence for dealing with crypto asset values. And the same will actually apply to Switzerland. So I think this is just a choice of, like how big the market is that you can service with, simplicity. And I believe that Switzerland will find a way to actually sort of be compatible, but it will take a little bit of time. Just be realizing that MiCA, as dealing with crypto assets, has just been established. It's going to take effect actually to the end of next year. So there's a lot of regulatory work for a lot of companies, much more companies from a numbers perspective than today actually have been going successfully through the regulatory process. And, that's going to be effort after that. So it's going to be like 2-3 years out before that can happen.
Bill, I was going to say, do you think it will turn out that Maker has perhaps overdone it on the regulation? Like I know it was one of the first ones.
There's a lot of elements that we luckily got out of MiCA, which didn't take place within MiCA. I think it's striking a good balance right now. I mean, they were even talking about hosted wallets and sort of, kill switches for smart contracts and, and basically, preventing Bitcoin from existing because it had, no ESG sort of data associated with a lot of silly things, right? But I think that the benefit of all this is right now there is a large part of, economic value markets that basically now can deal with regulatory confidence. And I think that will actually, I call this sort of the Brussels effect that, we've seen in data that basically Brussels with data regulation had an effect on California, had then an effect on the wider United States market. I think similar things are going to happen here where the trial bed or test bed of what we're being able to do here in Europe is going to actually educate the legislators in America to maybe look a little more favorably into these things. But, if we don't do this right, then obviously it won't happen.
All good insights on the regulatory side, always appreciated. In terms of the market phasing, I think we may have touched upon this altogether, but where are we in the industry? And with regards to this topic specifically, How is this kind of acting as a stepping stone to the next phase of ultimate adoption and what that looks like? I know super broad questions, but I think there may be some cool answers.
Well, I sort of touched on this earlier. I think we're at an early innings of the entire journey. Certainly from a capability perspective, and this idea of some kind of uniformity growing across the globe of regulatory entities, regulators. So that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is how long until a certain proportion, a critical mass of existing instruments and products of all sorts of financial services migrate to using these type of technologies, blockchain specifically. I mean, quite frankly, I think that's a multi-decade journey at best. You're going to see a lot of inertia there. But as I said before, there'll be some kind of a hockey stick tipping point or inflection there when it becomes just abundantly obvious that certain capabilities and features are trivial to implement using these technologies and just vastly quicker, and in the end, a lot cheaper at scale. I don't know exactly when that'll be, but it's not going to be in the next couple of years.
Anyone else, any opinions to vest before we close it out?
So the idea of tokenization has been around for like nearly a decade now, right? So I think, people tend to forget that there's a lot of heavy lifting that has already been done in terms of like getting clarity. And still, I agree with Michael that is just happening. And now we're going to have to see how that manifests itself into tools and institutions. And we know institutions are slow on these things, and they need to take care of custody first before they actually can create new offerings on the digital asset side for their customers. But, I think it might be actually I'm a little more optimistic that it's not going to be a decade before we're going to see some significant things happen in comparison to what the crypto market was. So in terms of like, it may be a blip on the radar in comparison to what the overall financial market is, that it's not going to take over the entire market on that side. But I think it's going to be significant from actually the importance of what, this segment carries for the overall application of blockchain and technology into the financial market space. So and that is not necessarily just digitizing something. So it's not like taking the New York Times and putting that into PDF and sending that out by email, which is already great, but it's actually creating products that actually look more like, the New York Times today, which is a very different product than the print product, right? So it's up to us to really make that shine and not just be cost efficiency, because in the end, if the institutions get paid the fees that they get paid, they couldn't care less in transitioning over to this. Actually, it's more like a new product that we all have to create together now that these elements are in place. And I think that's going to be the exciting piece of the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, plenty of room for them to eat too. The institutions were seeing that, and eventually we'll see savings pass through, and that's good for the bottom line. But listen, gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining. Mike, JD, Sid, Philipp, amazing conversation here. Great insights across the board, even outside the topic of convo. Hope you can stay around for some other panels, and looking forward to more to come.